There he is. Okay, Josh, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here for Gramercy Book Club. I'm Linda Cass. Josh, you and I first began corresponding, as you may recall, in
decades ago.
Yeah, really, January 2020. Because, and you can talk about this a bit when you start with discussing this a little bit later, but your book was supposed to come out in June of last year, but delayed due to COVID. So
Right.
I've been singing its praises for quite a while, and I'm thrilled it's now out in the world.
Thank you, Linda.
Now, just to remind all our participants, you were introduced sort of before you came on. Morningside Heights is Josh's fourth novel, his previous ones winning high acclaim, and he also authors short stories and leads the MFA program at Brooklyn College. And Josh, I believe you're in Brooklyn now joining us. Josh, our moderator tonight is Nancy Gilson. She's led a really great, robust discussion of your novel, and she's not only a seasoned journalist and editor, but she's written many feature stories of books and authors over the years. Everyone's now muted, so you and Nancy can actually begin your conversation. Nancy, the floor is yours now. Are you unmuted, Nancy?
I'm sorry, forgot. Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry. Hi, Josh. Welcome.
Hi, Nancy. How are you?
I'm
I see that Stephanie and Josh Feinberg. Stephanie's talking and Josh Feinberg there, and I think I saw a Steinman maybe. So anyone I know there, just want to say hi to.
Oh, that's great. You've got your fan club here. Well, thank you for doing this. And of course, all of us in Bexley are just dying to know how you decided to make Prue come from Bexley. How did that happen?
It's kind of random. I wanted her to come from somewhere that wasn't a big city. I had a friend in college, and then actually I lived in Ann Arbor for a bunch of years, who grew up in Bexley, and I just knew it as a Jewish suburb of Columbus. And you have to choose a place, and that seemed like a good place.
That's great. Well, that was fun. It was great fun to start the book and have that jump out at us. So tell us a little bit about the book is just lovely, and we've talked a lot about how it's more from Prue's perspective and Arlo's perspective than from Spence's. Can you tell a little bit about why you went that direction, why you wrote it with those characters in their perspective rather than from Spence's?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I never really considered writing it from Spence's perspective. I think in part because, well, I mean, I'm not a particularly performative writer, and I think trying to ventriloquize someone who has Alzheimer's feels performative, but I think also it's in other ways like, I tell my grad students that you shouldn't write a story about a ball rolling down a hill because it's going to roll down the hill. And I feel like, unfortunately, given the state of medicine right now, there's not much tension in what's going to happen to Spence. He's going to decline. And so I was really much more interested in what the people who are lucid did in response to his diagnosis, the people who love him, his family, his friends, his colleagues. But then also, I mean, the book started out as a long short story, and it was inspired. My father was a professor at Columbia who had Alzheimer's, though he had it much later in life than Spence did. And he had gotten in his late 80s. And when he was in decline, my mother started to go to a caregivers class at the JCC on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I was just interested in that because my mother is not a consorting with strangers kind of person. And I was interested in what had happened to her such that she would feel comfortable in the company of people who she didn't have much in common with, aside from the fact that they were all caregivers. So, I mean, although there are a lot of characters in the book and they're all important to me, I do see it as Prue's book. I was interested in someone, who went off to Yale, started a PhD, and was heading, along an academic path, and then really gave up her career and her vision for what she was going to do by marrying Spence and raising their kids And that's not such an unusual path, but it's maybe fairly unusual for someone like her. And so, when Spence declines, he's not even fully aware of what's wrong. But in some ways, she's really hitched her wagon to his star. And so it's at least as big a loss for her as it is for him, because she's so identified with his success.
Yeah. I was curious about, you have him taking the experimental drug. And I think the one in your book is fictional, or is it based on that kind of new drug that just recently came out, or?
It's not. I mean, because I wrote the book before that new drug
Yeah.
came out. That drug sounds horrible.
I know.
I mean, whatever. We're talking about fiction here, but that seems like a really bad news move on the FDA's part. But no, it's a fictional drug. I originally called it Zenithia, and then I looked up and realized that Zenithia is some figure in a major comic book series. So I changed it to Zenithia.
Oh, that's interesting. I was talking with the group before about this. I love the humor that came out in the book. I love the way that Arlo was shelving the books in the bookstore, and I loved his little notes about the mistakes he made in grammar or in writing. I don't know. Tell us about how you arrived at that.
I mean, at Arlo in general?
Yes, at Arlo, the character of Arlo, and he's just so quirky. And I just talk about him for a little bit.
Yeah. So he actually, I spent 8 years writing the book, and I wrote 3,000 pages. So there were a lot of wrong paths along the way. Arlo came along, not in a super late draft, but he wasn't there originally. And at some point I said to myself, what if Spence had a wife in a previous marriage and there was a son? And I thought, nah, that doesn't sound right. But then I tried it, and the book really took off, and Arlo's voice really took over. I think my instinct to do that probably had to do with, fiction needs to defamiliarize the familiar and familiarize the unfamiliar. And, as I was saying before, there's a risk to writing about Alzheimer's because there's something predetermined about the disease course. You don't want to write a story about a ball rolling down a hill. And I didn't want to simply write about that. Also, Sarah is a character who more or less does what we would expect her to do, given that she's Spence and Prue's kid. She excels academically. She ends up in medical school. I just wanted to write about someone who would give Spence some trouble and who was a live wire in some way and didn't exactly fit in with everyone else. And Arlo really fit the bill for that.
Were you ever Arlo to your own dad?
No, unfortunately. I think my fantasy was that I would be Arlo to my own dad. I think I was a lot more Sarah to my own dad.
So 8 years writing this book. Why did it take that long?
Takes a long time to write a book.
Yeah.
It's funny. I write every day, and I'm not a slow writer in the sense that I do produce a lot of pages. There's just a lot of pages that have to go. I don't know. It's a really rare writer of literary fiction who's producing, books every year or two. Joyce Carlos is an exception. But I don't think it has to take me 8 years. It just did. I think every book takes you as long as it takes. My second novel, Matrimony, took me 10. My first and my third, Somebody Across Upton and The World Without You, took me less. I think one took me 3, one took me 5. I feel like I should be able to write a book in 3 to 5 years, but you can't rush it. And this just took what it took.
One of our book club members wants to know, do you write on more than one project at a time?
I try to. And I wish I had that excuse for why this took 8 years. I'm not a good multitasker. You know, I can't rub my stomach and pat my head at the same time. I am kind of working on 2 novels now at the same time, but I worry it's a way of working on neither of them. I'm just a very focused person. And so usually one project wins out. But I'd like to work. I mean, I do have multiple things that I'm kind of sort of working on, but usually when I get deep into a book, I mean, there are other distractions. I teach, I have a wife, 2 kids, a large dog, some friends. I mean, there are things that, I mean, it's not like I'm sitting there all day, but I do write every day. And
Yeah.
I count my hours diligently. And when I don't write, I put a big fat 0 on my calendar to keep myself honest. So I think ultimately I am working on one project, but I dabble in other things at the same time.
So are you working on something now? You can say what you're working
on? Well, what do you mean by now? So I mean, the weird thing about, and the good thing about the books being delayed, it was for me the one good thing about COVID is that, you know, I always tell my grad students and I tell myself that I think it's good to be working on a new project when your book comes out, just because, I don't know, I really like I feel like when I'm writing, that's when I'm in control. I mean, doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to get it right, but I know that I can keep on trying until I get it right. Whereas when the book comes out, you know, there's just a lot that's out of your control in terms of, you know, will the reviews be good, how will sales be? I mean, I've been really fortunate for this book and in general, but it's still out of your control. And so I don't really love the publication time process. But so in any case, I try to have a new project going when I have a book come out, but I've never been able to before because just the way the publication process works, you know, by the time you're done with copy editing and proofreading and the book goes into galleys and then you're doing publicity for the book, there's no time. But because Morningside Heights was supposed to come out last June, it was already in galleys last spring, it was really ready to go. I mean, Linda received her copy, you know, as we said, decades ago. And I was on teaching leave in the fall. So I actually managed to finish most of a draft of a relatively short novel, which is very fast for me. I think, I mean, the book's horrible. I mean, the book I hope will be good eventually, but right now it's horrible. It has to be horrible before it's good. But yeah, I have a few hundred pages of that. And I mean, I don't want to say too much about it other than that. I mean, it does take place among the kinds of characters that my books usually take place among, namely, you know, Northeastern, overeducated, often Jewish, but not always Jewish characters. But there is something different about the book, is that there's a speculative premise. But I've never done that before. I'm not a speculative writer. So that's an interesting challenge for me. And I think the book will, I think if you end up reading it eventually, the book will feel like it's a book that I wrote, but it's different in certain ways. So I don't want to say more than that, but I'm excited about it.
Another one of our club members wants to know if you could talk about the structure of Morningside Heights, when it evolved and how it evolved.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I mean, and I can answer that question and also give you a less glib answer to why the book took 8 years. Or at least an answer that's a little more in the weeds. And I would say that there were 2 principal struggles. One was an emotional struggle, which I'll get to in a second, but one was an aesthetic struggle, which I think touches on the person's question. So, as I said before, you know, the book kind of took off when I started to write Arlo, but it also proposed some real, well, it posed some real structural problems, because Arlo is a character who, when he's there, he's really there. He can kind of, like, you know, hijack a scene in certain ways, but he also disappears for long periods of time. Mm-hmm. And the question was how to structure the book so that it both evoked his centrality to the novel, his importance, but also evoked his big absence. And And well, I've learned a lot from Alice Munro, but one of the things I've learned from Munro is that structure, if done well, can be beautiful. A lot of my grad students think that plot and structure are at best a necessary evil. And I spent 2 years trying to disabuse them of that. But I actually think it's more than just necessary. It can, if done well. You know, often what you tell can be less important than how you tell it or when you tell it. And in an earlier draft of the book, you know, I was reading Rebecca Mackay's The Great Believers, which is a great book. And that's a book that has two, I don't know how many of you read it, but it has two narratives. There's a 1980s Chicago AIDS narrative, and there is a contemporary kind of missing person in Paris narrative, sort of. And the book goes back and forth, chapter to chapter, between those two narratives. But there's also a kind of jigsaw puzzle feel to that book. So you're trying to figure out the connections between the two narratives. And I think because I love that book and I was reading it while I was writing this book, I came under the influence of that structure, which is right for that book, but was not right for this book. And so I was kind of bopping back and forth between a lot of different strands of the book, and we never had a chance to really settle. So I'd have, you know, a chapter while Sarah is in LA, and then a chapter while Sarah is in college, and then a chapter when Spence and Prue get married, and a chapter when Arlo moves in, and a chapter when Spence is declining. And I felt the book wasn't really gaining traction. And then just, you know, serendipitously, I was asked to blurb Joan Silber's, not her most recent novel, but 2 novels ago, her novel Improvement, which is a book I love, but more important for this book, there's something about that book, and I can't even remember what it was, that gave me the inspiration for how to structure the book in these 8 parts. So that even though it does move around in time, and that even though there are various parallel narratives, the way the book is structured now allows the reader to settle in for a period of time. And the way that I think the different sections, you know, rub up against each other allow for a certain measure of suspense. So yeah, so structure was a big conundrum for me. And when I finally figured it out, that was when the book came together.
Yeah, one of our participants described the book in very complimentary words about the structure, saying that she thought it was like doors were opening when, you know, kind of you didn't expect them to, and then they kept opening and you kept seeing more parts of the story unfolding. And I thought that was really lovely. And at the same time, it, you know, if you think about that, it sounds like it could be clunky or clumsy, but it wasn't at all. It's just so beautiful the way the book unfolds and the story unfolds.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, I think that is a great analogy. And, you know, and then the question is like how you pull it off. Like, are you opening up the right rooms of the house at the right time? Are you showing the prospective buyers of the house the right angles? I mean, I'm running with the metaphor probably more than is necessary. But I mean, you know, Munro talks about, well, Munro doesn't talk about it, but I think of Munro's work as being, and it's a different analogy to the house, but I think it's a similar kind of thing. Like you're peeling back the layers of an onion, that there are more layers and more layers.
Yeah.
You realize. And yeah, so.
Here's another question. As a fiction writing instructor, excuse me, what do you tell your students about the value of plotting versus writing without some outline?
Depends on the student. So, but I actually would not distinguish, I mean, I would not, that dichotomy between plotting and outline, I guess I wouldn't buy into that. In other words, I think a book needs a story. I think you need a narrative, but that doesn't mean that you need to outline it. Most of my grad students, you know, I'm very fortunate to teach really talented young writers. So we have about 300 applicants every year for 15 spots. So it's very hard to get in, and the students who get in and come are outstanding. But they, by and large, with some exceptions, are better at certain things and worse at other things. And the things they're better at, which are actually harder to teach, are they have a sense of language. They're able to make characters jump off the page. They are much less good at telling a story, and at plot in some way, and making us want to read on because we want to know what happens next. And so a lot of what I do and what we all do in our graduate program is we spend a lot of time teaching our students to think about narrative and to take narrative seriously. And so I certainly, C.S. Eliot talked about the meaning of the poem being the piece of meat that the burglar throws to the family dog. Or someone else I know described plot as how we distract the reader so we can pick their pocket. And what's in their pocket is character, writing, etc. And that's really important, but if you cannot distract the reader, to pick their pocket, you won't get what's inside their pocket. So I feel really strongly that narrative, although it's not the end game, it is necessary. And I tend to overcompensate in that regard because I have a lot of grad students who are dubious about narrative for various reasons that I think are mostly defensive poses. But that's a separate question from how you go about writing. In other words, you can take narrative seriously, as I think every writer should, and choose to map out your story, or you can take narrative seriously, as I continue to think every writer should, and not map it out. And I think what you need to do is find a balance between knowing too much and knowing too little. And if you map out your story too soon, if you know too much, you get what a friend of mine calls Lipton cup of story, where you're injecting your characters into a preordained plot. And you don't want to do that because the relationship between plot and character is complex and symbiotic. We both create and are created by our characters. And so you don't want to, Charlie Baxter talks about characters who are overparented, where it feels like the writer knows the characters too well, too soon. And that is certainly to the detriment of the work. That's one extreme. The other extreme is that you just you're not thinking about narrative at all. And so you just write a lot of pretty sentences about mountains and sunsets. And that's not fiction either. I had a student once who said to me, Josh, I write poetically. And she was right, she did. But that wasn't always a good thing, because you want to write poetically when poetry is called for, and write less poetically when poetry is not called for. So I think the challenge is to find that balance between knowing too much and knowing too little. What I try to do, and I think you also need to know your own strengths and weaknesses. I think very analytically. I am by inclination plotter, someone who maps things out. And so I need to fight against that for the first draft. And that's why I write 3,000 pages and don't go back, because I think it's a mistake, especially for someone like me, to revise too soon, to outline too soon. But then once I have the mess, then I start to think practically. How is this going to help the book? How is that going to hurt the book? What might be in the story's interest, and so on and so forth. But I tell my students to think in terms of situations where there's conflict. Thanksgiving dinners, family reunions, places where situations that are high stakes and where people care about what's happening, and I think we're very conflict averse, a lot of us. And I think a fiction writer can't be conflict averse. I think the way you discover character is by sending your characters out in the world and getting them into trouble. And then I think every story, every novel has to answer what I call the Passover question. Why is this night different from all other nights? Of all the days that you could write about, why today? And that's a question that, the reader needs to feel that instinctively, the sense of urgency, what the stakes are. Yeah. And so I'm always thinking about narrative, but I'm resistant to outlining too early.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I think you said, had once said that a novelist's job is to describe, but not to judge. Did I get that right? And can you expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah, If I didn't say it, I should have. So, and I think I might have. Yeah. Well, so Flannery O'Connor writes about this, about that writing fiction is a humble job, and that you're writing with the senses. And if you want to write about big ideas, being a novelist is not the job for you. I mean, I guess the better way to put it is that people have said, like, people have asked me about this book and about others, and writers are often asked this. Fiction writers are often asked this: what's your novel? What's the takeaway? What do you want your readers to draw from the book? What's the message? Or even if you don't say the word message, what's what's the takeaway? And the answer is there is none. And Martin Amis has a novel called The Information. Came out a bunch of years ago, and it's a novel. It's kind of a spoof of book tours. The central character in that novel is a writer who, in a kind of fluky way, suddenly his book takes off and he becomes very famous. And he finds himself, on talk shows. And in one scene in the book, he's interviewed by a radio host who clearly hasn't read the book. And he says, so Bob, what's your book about? And he says, oh, not about anything. It just is. He says, no, Bob, what's your book about? He says, well, it's not about anything. It just is. If I could have written it in 200,000, fewer than 200, I say all 200,000 words of it. If I could have written it in fewer, I would have. And I think that's really true. For those who have kids, or for those who are teachers, we don't want the reader to read the cliff notes as opposed to the novel. And it's not simply because we don't want the person to get caught cheating. It's because we believe that if the cliff notes were a substitute for the novel, you'd just have the cliff notes. And so I feel strongly that fiction is irreducible, that the easier it is to summarize a novel, the worse the novel is. And so I feel like takeaways are for rabbis and priests and political scientists and philosophers, all of which are good professions. They're just not my profession.
Yeah.
My job is to make characters jump off the page. I don't feel like my readers need to like the characters as human beings. Like one of the pleasures of writing fiction and of reading fiction is that you get to spend time in the company of people whose company you might not want to spend time with in real life. But what I'm interested in doing is making the characters feel like they're as real as or realer than the people in the reader's life. And I want to tell a story. I want to transport the reader so they have gone somewhere new. And the way that I do that is by sending my characters out in the world and getting them into trouble. And although it feels like I haven't answered your question, I actually think I kind of have, because I think the way to do that is to describe a novel. I think Chekhov said some version of this, that the novelist, the story writer, is a mirror, not a judge. And I see this sometimes in my grad students, where you feel like the author's allegiances are clear. They like this character, they don't like that character. And that is a mistake. I feel like I don't have allegiances by characters. My allegiance is only to making the character be as true to him or her themselves as I can make them. And so in that sense, my job is to give them a fair shake and to describe them as opposed to casting judgment, which is, in any case, casting judgment on your characters is way too easy since you created them. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. My job is to just put them out in the world and have no judgments.
Yeah. So what are you reading these days?
I'm always reading. I read very widely. I occasionally meet people who say they want to write but don't read, and I think that that's not possible. Like, they may want to be a writer, but if you actually want to write, you have to love to read. And as with my characters, I hate to choose them. I don't like to say, these are my favorite writers, because then I regret having forgotten someone. I can tell you some books that I've read recently. I recently read Peter Ho Davies' new novel, called something like A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself.
Mhm.
It's a really wonderful book. It's about father. It's kind of similar to Jenny Offal, The Department of Speculation, except told from a male point of view. It's about art and about fatherhood. I read a first novel by Christine Smallwood called The Life of the Mind, which is a very kind of voicey sort of book, and not the kind of book that I usually gravitate toward, but I thought it was really transporting and so smart. Big fan of Elizabeth Strout.
Oh yeah.
There are different kinds of writers out there. And I think I do try to read widely, but in general, I'm drawn to writers who are not show-offy. I have nothing against sort of like prose that calls attention to itself. It's just not the way I write. And I actually think that there's a kind of beauty and simplicity. And I think it's hard to write. It's often harder to write more simply than it is to write more ornately. So yes, someone like Elizabeth Strout is very much a writer after my own heart. But I love Laurie Moore, who writes very different kinds of prose, but who's amazing.
Do you read mostly fiction? Are you reading?
I read book length material. I read mostly fiction. I read nonfiction, like in the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books. I mean, I do occasionally read nonfiction books, but I'm more drawn to fiction. I'm drawn to character, and I'm interested in books that like the Morningside Heights, that chronicle long relationships. Wallace Stegner's Crossing the Safety is one of my favorite books. Richard Yates's Revolutionary Road. And I'm also interested in writers who write about the seemingly inconsequential, but deeply consequential. And I guess what I mean by that is, so James Salter in Light Years says, life is weather, life is meals. And I agree with him. I think it's the small things in life that are most revealing. And sometimes the bigger things flatten distinctions of character. So for example, to talk about Morningside Heights, it was important to me to get every scene right. So it's not like I'm valuing one scene over the other, but in some ways I'm less interested in the scenes you'd expect, like the scene where Spence gets diagnosed and he takes the mini mental exam, or the scene when Prue is told by the chair of the English department that it's time for Spence to retire. The jig is up. I mean, those scenes are really important, and they're hard to write, and I had to get them right. But in some ways, my heart is more in the small, surprising scenes, like they're going to the New Year's Eve party, and Spence mistakes the word for festive and formal, or there's a mouse in the apartment, and Prue wants to catch the mouse the way sensible people catch mice, which is with a mousetrap. Spence, who, if he were lucid, would never even contemplate doing this because he's so much not a guy immersed in his body, wants to catch the mouse with his own two hands. But of course, what he really can't face is that he can't finish his book. And so he sort of displaces things onto this act of physical prowess that Prue isn't interested in, that he himself, if he were more lucid, wouldn't be interested. So I'm interested in in the mouse in the apartment kind of moment, in the New Year's Eve party with a mistakenly read invitation kind of moment. And in that regard, I think I really love a writer like Sally Rooney, especially. I mean, I know that Normal People is the book that's gotten the most attention, probably because of the Hulu series, which is just incredibly good. I mean, those two actors are amazing. But the Rooney book that I really love is her first book, Conversations with Friends, which I think is a better book. I like Normal People, but I think Conversations with Friends is a better book. And she writes so well about characters who are just hanging out, and to make just hanging out feel urgent is really hard to do, and it's what I like to try to do, to make those daily moments feel consequential. I love the Elif Batuman's The Idiot. But if you told me, do you want to read a first person, kind of transparently autobiographical book about an 18-year-old young woman and her love woes at Harvard, I couldn't have run far enough away. I just think, it's all in the execution.
Well, you certainly did wonderful things with execution in Morningside Heights. And
Thank you.
we're so grateful to have you
Thank you.
chat with us and share your insight. I think there aren't any more questions. I'm going to turn this back to Linda.
So let me just, before you turn it back to Linda, I just want to say a couple things. Like one thing about the book and then one thing about Linda. So I talked to a lot of book groups. So everyone who's on the Zoom, if you have friends who are book groups, you should feel welcome to put them in touch with me. And I'm happy to talk with them on Zoom. The thing that's not about Linda personally, in some ways, is that one of the, COVID was horrible. And my entire family got COVID, so we experienced it close up. We're all okay, thankfully. But as I said before, one of the blessings of COVID was that I kind of got a freebie and stuff, got to start and get deep into a draft of a new book. But what the biggest blessing of COVID for me was that it gave me an extra year to be in touch with people like Linda and other independent booksellers around the country. And I just want to say how grateful I am to Linda and to Gramercy Books and to countless independent booksellers around the country for their support of my work and their support of this book specifically, but also just beyond my book. Independent booksellers are the people who are keeping literature alive. They understand that books are not widgets. You go into an independent bookstore and it's like Cheers. They know your name, where everybody knows your name. But more than your name, they know your taste in books. And so I'm probably preaching to the choir here because you all are on this Zoom through Gramercy. But in case I'm not preaching to the choir, or in case you know other people who are not themselves choir members, I just want to say how important it is to buy your books from independent booksellers.
Oh, amen. That's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you.
I want to thank you too, Josh. And I just want to say, in case anyone is not aware, because we did mention this in some of our promotion about your book, and here is your wonderful book, by the way. Your independent booksellers gave you that love back in choosing your book as the #1 June pick of all books written in that month, the #1 pick. So obviously, it's a mutual admiration here. We're just thrilled that you have finally joined us and that this book is out in the world. And for those who have not read it, you have a treat in store. We encourage you to do so. And it was a really illuminating conversation. And we can't thank you, Josh, or Nancy enough for leading this for us. A very powerful novel. I want to also thank our streaming engineer, Nikki, who's up in the corner, but kind of monitoring what's happening behind the scenes, and for all of you tonight in participating in the discussion and your outstanding questions and comments. If you take a final look at the chat box, you'll not only have links to upcoming author programs we have, but also a link to purchase Morningside Heights. So please do so. It is wonderful. And just to say, we're open 7 days a week and welcome you and have curbside pickup and just want to say thanks Josh, thanks Nancy, thanks Nikki, thanks all of you for spending part of your evening with Gramercy Books, and we hope to see you again. And Josh, I hope to see you in person for that next book of yours.
I would love that. I miss being, it's obviously certain ways easier to do this at home, but I miss being able to meet readers and booksellers in person, and hopefully there'll be a lot more of that ahead for all of us.
Hope so.
We hope so. Well, everyone, thank you for being with us. Thank you, Josh and Nancy. Good
Thank
night
you.
to all.
So I want to say a quick hi to Karen Moss, who I see wrote a message, and I didn't get a chance to say hi to her. So hi to everyone whom I know. Thanks so much.
Okay,
You should.
thanks.